this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to graft in pattern without having to deal with live stitches. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. Grafting in a stitch pattern other than stockinette or garter stitch can be tricky, and it's especially tricky to graft live stitches in pattern right off the needles. The chance of making an error and having to undo part of the graft is quite high. So my preference is to work these types of grafts using an adaptation of the toe chimney method I demonstrated last week. This method is ideal for grafting together the two ends of a strip of fabric into a loop, such as for cowls, sleeve cuffs, headbands, and hats. This method produces a graft that is perfectly aligned at the edges and maintains the stitch pattern continuity right across the graft. So let's get started. So this is an example of what we'll be doing today. So this was a strip of fabric, started out as a strip of fabric that I then grafted together, and I grafted in order to maintain the stitch pattern continuity. So one of these is the grafting thread. I think that one is. The graft is actually these upper purl bumps across here, and then I grafted across here. So there's a little weirdness in this ridge right here, but that's actually not the graft, that's something below the graft. The stitch pattern continuity has been maintained. So I want 10 complete repeats of this 6-row pattern. So that means when this is been grafted together in a loop, I will have 60 rows of stitches. But the graft is going to create a row of stitches. So what I have in here is the total number of repeats minus 1 row. So I start with the waste yarn and I work in pattern, then I switch, and then at the end I switch back to waste yarn and work in pattern for a row or two as I bind off. So what I want for my pattern is for the first row to be a right side row. The shaded rows are right side rows for me. So I want the first row to be a right side row. Sometimes patterns are set up so the very first row is a wrong side row. So if your pattern is set up like that, you just need to move one row from the beginning to the end of the repeat or from the end to the beginning, either way. Because what you want is row 2 to be a wrong side row, and it's going to be row 2 that is our grafting row. So that's the row that we are going to create when we do our graft. So I'm going to cast on the number of stitches I need for my pattern using waste yarn. You can use any cast on you like. I prefer using the long tail cast on, but you really can use any cast on method that you like. And now I'm going to work my first right side row using the waste yarn. So I'm going to be knitting 5 stitches, purling 1, knitting 6, purling 1, and knitting 2. Okay, so I have worked row 1 in pattern, and if you look under the needle, you can see that I have 5 knit stitches. I have a purl bump right there, then I have 6 knit stitches right under the needle, a purl bump, and then the final 2 knit stitches, and that's what my row 1 pattern is. So now I'm going to work row 2 using my main yarn. So now what do we have under the needle? Well, we have a second row of knit stitches. So as I worked across the stitches using the pink yarn, I got a new row of white stitches that were in the pattern. So row 2 that I just worked is in white. It won't be until I work this next row of stitches that I will get my first row of pink. So at this point I have worked nearly the complete 10 repeats. I need to work the final row I've just did the cable crossing row, and now I need to work the final row using the main color row. So you can see here I have the starting tail over on the left side when we view from the right side of the work. And we've got the finishing tail here on the right edge. And this is where I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to cut the tail long enough to be used as the grafting yarn. So typically 4 times, the width of whatever it is your grafting should be sufficient. So I'm just going to make sure I cut enough. So I've got my grafting tail here, and now I'm going to switch back to the waste yarn, and I'm going to work row 1 of the pattern. So now I'm working row 1 of the pattern, and just like when we began working with the pink yarn at the start of the project, what's coming off the needles in row 1 pattern are the pink stitches. The pink stitches are the ones that are getting the row 1 pattern. The waste yarn did not become the row 1 pattern. It was the pink stitches that were still on the needle that became row 1. I have the first row here in pink is row 3, and the row before that is a row 2. What I have up here under the needles in pink is a row 1 pattern, and what I have on the needles here will become the pattern that I work on this next row. I'm going to continue the pattern, so I'm going to work row 2 right now, but I'm going to work it as I bind off. So this is the end, this is the start, and this is the end. We want to bring the end around. We want to bring the 2 ends around so that they can meet. So this is the ending point. This is where our yarn tail is attached. It's on the right hand side. We look at where this white stitch, that's the starting stitch, where it's entering the stitch. You see how it's coming in underneath and up here? So we want our pink yarn to do the same thing. We want it to come up where this white yarn is, and we're going to pull it through. So this is a little tricky. So what you're going to do is you're going to come from behind, coming through as if you are purling. Then you're going to take your needle and come underneath this, from left to right, underneath the strand that's connecting each edge. You're going to come underneath, like, make sure I'm not catching anything, underneath, and pull this through. So you see how you've created this little twisted loop like that, where the tail is coming underneath it. I'm going to pull it a little bit like this. And then it's going to cross over. So now you can follow the path of this bump. So you can see that this head of this stitch comes down through this pink loop here. So that's just that setup at the edge, and that's kind of tricky. From now on, we're going to follow the path of each stitch. We're going to follow the path of the running threads of each of these stitches here. So we're going to look at, we can see these stitches, we kind of can see the V of this stitch. This is the second stitch, and this is the first stitch. So we're going to, you can see how there's a connecting bit of yarn between these two. So we're going to come in from right to left. So we're always going to catch, from now on, we're always going to catch 2 loops of yarn following the path of the running threads on the lower half of the edge, and following the path of the heads of the stitches on the upper part. So we always look where we came before. So we can see where this pink yarn is coming through this horizontal bit of purl bump. We're going to come back up through here because we're following the path of this stitch. So we come up, follow the path of the head to come down. And then on this side, on this edge, we look at where, I may have split a stitch here. Hopefully that won't be too bad. We look at where we came out before. We can see the base of these stitches. We're going to catch the two legs on this edge like that. come back on the upper side of the graft, and again we see where we came through before. We came through this stitch, so we're going to come back up through it, and we're going to follow the path of the head of this white stitch, which comes down through this pink loop. So as we go, we can check to see if we're getting the correct pattern. So we are, but it is loose. So we want to correct the tension as we go. Every few stitches, you can kind of tighten up this tension. So we're coming back where we were before. We find the two white loops. We're going to catch that connecting white loop, follow the path of that connecting white loop. Come back to the other side. Follow the path of this head of that stitch. Once again, we're following the path of the base of this stitch here, catching the two loops. And now we're switching to the cable, which was done in stockinette stitch. So this time we're going to bring our needle behind these stitches, because that's where the path of the head of that stitch is. Come down and across here, catching these two legs here. Now let's check our tension. We could probably tighten this up a bit. So here's where we have a transition. So instead of coming down and up through this one, we're coming down and around this way. We're switching from a knit to a purl. So the path of the white strand is a little different. It's coming down through here and then up this way. So just depending on the stitch that you are working with, it's going to look a little different. So now we have this stitch, we're following the path. So we're coming under here, follow the head, and then come back behind. And then for the last stitch, I just come through here to finish off. At this point, you check to make sure that your pink stitches look like they are following the correct path. And then you can take out your waste yarn. For the bind off chain, you can pull it out and just ravel it. But for the cast on chain, you're going to have to do some snips and then pick it out. Make sure that you're not getting any of the main yarn when you're snipping. Okay, so here's the graft. I have a few stitches that are a little bit loose here that I could correct. So you can see that these are where the two tails are, and so the graft is in here, but it's difficult to see. I don't know that anybody would be able to find it. I would strongly suggest trying out this technique on swatches to get the hang of it. I would also suggest using needles several sizes larger than typical for your yarn, as I did in the demonstration, to make seeing the path of the waste yarn easier while you get the hang of the process. As mentioned, this technique works really well for grafting a fabric strip into a loop because the stitch pattern continuity is maintained perfectly. You could adapt this method when grafting two separate pieces of fabric that are worked identically and then joined at the center, but the stitch patterns will be offset by a half a stitch at every point in the row where you switched from one stitch type to another. The more transitions you make, the more obvious the offsets are. If you have any comments about this video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.